Okay, I think we better get started, and I can try to catch people up if they have a chance to join. I appreciate those of you who are here and want to be respectful of your time. Let me share my screen. Okay, so my name is Meagan Garland, and I am an employment lawyer, but my industry focus is on fashion and beauty. And so my clients are in that industry, and I wanted to help those of you who are budding designers, who are seasoned designers, those of you who are creating your brands to keep in mind some legal considerations and just to share some things with you. So today I'm going to talk about building your brand and making your mark, especially top legal tips for fashionpreneurs. All right, so the goals for the presentation today is I'd like by the end of the presentation for everyone to know that number one, fashion law is a thing. It is an actual industry, and there are lots of laws that apply, and almost anything that you can think of, any law that you can think of for the most part, fashion touches it in some way, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Also want to talk with you about legal considerations, so hopefully when you are done with this session, you'll have some things to kind of tuck away in the back of your mind when you are building your brand. Also want to help you be mindful of pitfalls to avoid and planning for success. So those are the four goals in the four seasons that we're going to go through during our conversation today. So for the spring season, what is fashion law? It is a relatively new industry, I will say, probably the last 10 years or so as a recognized industry. However, the law has been in place for quite some time. So according to the Fashion Law Institute, fashion law embraces the legal substance of style, including all of the issues that may arise throughout the life of a garment, starting with the designer's original idea and continuing all the way to the consumer's closet. From the historical relationship between clothing and culture to current issues involving the globalization of fashion, the newly defined field of fashion law is made to measure for the modern apparel industry. So as I said before, almost any law that you can imagine touches the industry. So what does that mean? Here's a couple of areas. Animal law, you might not realize it, but animal rights is a big area in the fashion industry. When you think of leather goods, when you think of furs and animal skins, there are a host of laws, and a lot of them are governed by federal legislation, for example, the PETA, that protect animals. So there's law that's on both sides of this issue. Antitrust laws, child labor laws, and we're going to talk a little bit about sourcing and making sure that your sourcing is clean and that you're aware who's doing your work, you're aware of where your work is coming from and how your products have been obtained. Similarly, environmental law, ethics, financing and corporate structures, government regulations, human traffic prevention, and this is something that mainly comes up in the area of models, for example, who there have been a trend of models who've been coming across borders by way of human trafficking. So that's an area to prevent that from happening. Intellectual property is a huge area, making sure that designers who have made something that is original and creative and artistic are able to protect their designs. However, as we'll discover, it's not as protective in some areas as you might think. International trade, marketing, real estate, sustainability and economic development, and tax. Now, I'm highlighting these in pink because these are the areas that I practice. Contracts, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, employment law, B2 legislation, which often goes hand in hand with employment law, as well as modeling law. So we're going to get into some of these, and I'm happy to answer questions along the way. And for those of you who are comfortable putting on your screen and being interactive and participating, it'd be great to see all of you. No worries if you don't want to do that, but it is an invitation. And if you have questions and you want to put them in the chat or ask directly, you can do that. And I'm happy to stop and answer whatever questions that you have. So here are just a couple of cases and some examples that have been literally snatched from the headlines. So just this past year, there was a case, Tiffany & Co. versus Costco Wholesale Corp., and that was in the Southern District of New York. And in that case, the issue was whether Costco had copied Tiffany's jewelry. It was selling jewelry, especially rings, for around $6,000 and up, and calling those rings Tiffany. And so Tiffany & Co. obviously sued under the understanding that this was infringing on its brand. And initially, the court agreed with them and awarded $21 million to Tiffany. However, when the Southern District Court got involved, and they found, by the way, the lower court that it was counterfeit, but when the Southern District of New York got involved, they ultimately reversed that decision. And the reason that they did that is they found that the name Tiffany is not unique enough to be considered protectable under intellectual property law. So this is just an indicator of how I said before, there are some boundaries of how protective the law can be on intellectual property. So it's always a good idea before you make an effort to publicize your brand, publicize your items, just to be aware of what the legal protections may be on that front and take appropriate precautions to document at least whether you were the first in time using a particular design or pattern, and make sure that you can do all of those things in advance and be able to distinguish your brand. And now I'm going to show, I don't know if those of you who are watching know what these brands all have in common. And if not, I'm going to share some of them with you. Of course, these are all popular American brands. And some are popular in the US and not American brands, but they're popular here in the US. And what these brands have in common is that they have all been sued under various federal and state employment laws for discrimination, harassment, retaliation, all sorts of things. So just by way of example, Abercrombie & Fitch some years ago was sued for refusing to hire a young woman, Samantha Alouf, who is a Muslim American woman. And she was wearing a hijab in her interview, and essentially, to put it nicely, Abercrombie & Fitch determined that she was not the typical American girl, which is what their brand tended to promote. And ultimately, the court sided with Ms. Alouf and found that her religious views, her ability to wear her hijab, is something that is protected. It's a protected category under the law. It's protected both when you're applying for a job, when you're in a job. And so Abercrombie & Fitch did not have the authority under the law to fail to hire her for that reason. Now, could they have decided to not hire her for other reasons? Of course, but not on the basis of a protected category like religion. Similarly, Wet Seal was accused of denying equal pay to various employees who were African American. And that has been kind of a theme throughout much of this litigation, you'll see. And in that situation, the court was settled, the case was settled, but it was for $7.5 million. So the point is here that there is a cost to actions, both in fashion as well as other industries. And these are all cautionary tales. Not that I think that any of you would run afoul of any of these laws, but it's important to be aware. And I will explain a little bit more why that is, because sometimes we get ensnared in legal issues without realizing that we are. A lot of it has to do with policies that you have in place or don't have in place. And if we don't create the narrative and set the facts, then the person who is working for you or contracted by you or using your brand or what have you can create the narrative themselves. And often that's motivated by money, motivated by other things. So it's important to know what protections you can put in place to protect yourself from that. Similarly, Louis Vuitton was accused of racism by a sales associate. We've seen that as well with Versace and a host of others. So these are all top brands. But one of the things I wanted to mention is that the gentleman who you see here is actually a costume designer and, or I'm sorry, not a photographer, and his name is Bruce Weber, and he was accused of sexual harassment. And the important thing here, why I put his face here, is to know that some employment laws are can be alleged against an individual. So we'll get to some important factors about how to limit liability, but it's important to know that while you can't necessarily bring discrimination, retaliation, and other sorts of claims against individuals, harassment is one of the ones that you can. So it's important to note that Bruce Weber here was accused of sexual harassment in his individual capacity. Hi, Audrey. So now we're going to move into the summer season. And here are a couple of tips that I want to give you for legal consideration. So the first is know the details. And when I say details, I mean specific details about your brand, about your company, about your efforts. There are some things that you do not want to delegate, that you don't want to outsource. So if you are creating a product that is being sourced, like I said, maybe being manufactured abroad and sold in various places, maybe online, some in brick and mortar places, there should be no part of your brand, no part of your business with which you are unfamiliar. Because, especially when you're just getting started, because when you outsource details that are that important, it's easy when you're getting started to be taken advantage of. And that's why I say starting with sourcing, knowing that you're not violating any child labor laws, knowing where the materials come from so that you can be truthful in your advertising. Is it really organic? Is it really free of animal cruelty? Those sorts of things. So wrapping your arms around exactly what your product is, what your design is, what your business is really the first step in any legal protection. The second thing, like I mentioned before, is consider limiting liability. So even if it's you alone, it's you, your business, there are ways that you can structure a corporate structure or a limited liability entity of some sort to be able to protect you from personal liability. Should you end up in a tort lawsuit of some kind, someone can allege that they've been personally injured by a product, or that a product was somehow defective, or that you breached a contract, or whatever it is. You want to make sure that to the extent possible, you are not held personally liable in your individual capacity, meaning that your house, for example, is not attached to your bank account, personal bank account attached. So these are rules that are applicable in every jurisdiction. So the proper type of attorney that you would talk to for that is a corporate formation attorney. So you want to have a conversation with that person and figure out really, for the type of work that you're doing, how can you limit liability? And also, what are the costs that are associated with that? Not just having your entity created and established, but also there are taxing obligations that are attached to that. So be aware of that. And also, every jurisdiction is different. So we'll get to a little bit later, choosing the jurisdictions in which you want to conduct your business. And so knowing the rules for doing business in your state, like I said. So for example, I practice in California. There are lots of wonderful things about California. My job is always busy because California is at the forefront of all employment issues. It's very employee friendly. Those things are great, especially for employees, but sometimes for employers, they need to be very aware of landmines that they might encounter. So I'm just using California as an example, but similar states are like Massachusetts, Illinois, New York, for example. So being aware of, number one, what the requirements are to do business in your state. So do you need a license to do business? Do you need to have a particular corporate name registered? Do you need to, if you're incorporated in another state, get permission, authorization to do business in the jurisdiction where you're presently located? What are the implications for the types of lawsuits that are very common? Do you want to have employees in that state? Do you not want to have employees in that state? So these are all things that you want to think about before you decide to plant roots anywhere, and before you plant specific roots, like where is your main place of business going to be? So these are all things that you want to consider. Additionally, employment policies and mandatory trainings. So oftentimes people don't really think about the policies that go into place before starting a business. And really you should have, if you are planning to hire employees and in fashion or in design or whatever your industry focus is, you want to make sure that you know what not only the protections are for the employees, but the flip side of that is what are your obligations. And so you really want to have these obligations documented in a manual. It can be electronic, it can be physical, but something that your employees can look to and see what it is that they are entitled to. So for example, do you have employees who are non-exempt, which means they're not exempt from all of the wage and hour laws, which means they are entitled to, in some jurisdictions, like rest breaks and meal breaks and overtime. These are all things that you want to start the proper way, because in this area of the laws, especially to underscore, in some jurisdictions, liability goes back for 4 years. And so if you don't start it properly, it's a highly technical area where liability can accrue. Technical violations usually result in penalties. And so you just want to be aware that you have those policies and work with someone to help you prepare them. What you don't want to do, and I will say this for all areas of the law that we're going to touch on today, is do not rely on templates that you find online. I know it is very tempting to, Google, how do I create a contract for this, that, or the other thing? But I must caution against that, because often the creator of those contracts, of those templates, of those policies, of those forms, are not considering the nuances of the particular jurisdiction where you may be, number one, or they're not up to date on what the actual law is in your jurisdiction, or they might leave out very important details that might apply to your specific industry, while they might apply differently to a transportation industry or to the hospitality industry. They may apply very differently to you and the fashion industry. So it's very important to be weary of boilerplate policies that you can just find online. And just think to yourself, it's a little bit, if it seems like it's too easy, if it seems like it's too good to be true, it probably is. Also along those lines, be aware of mandatory trainings. So there's been a lot of changes in the law as a result of the Me Too movement that have taken requirements that used to be on a macro level, that used to be just for big corporations, right? You know that big corporations are required to provide things like sexual harassment training, like maybe ADA training, and those sorts of things. However, with the Me Too movement, a lot of these trainings have been imposed upon much smaller entities. So again, using California as an example, and New York is very similar, you now have, if you have 5 employees in California, you must provide sexual harassment training, and you must provide that every other year and every 6 months after you hire an employee. And it's not just for management, it's also for rank and file employees. So it's very important to know exactly what you are required to do alongside, obviously, what you are gifted and very talented at doing, which is running your fashion business and building your brand. Also, I want to keep in mind sourcing implications that I touched on earlier. So one of the big trends that we're seeing in the industry is lawsuits that have to do with, how products came to be, what the baseline product is. So, for example, if you are gathering certain materials from, say, a factory in China, and you know that they're delivering the materials to the factory to then be manufactured. Do you know where those materials came from? Do you know who was working and gathering the raw materials to create those fabrics that then you are using for your designs? And this is very important on the lines of child abuse laws, for example, or also IP rights, and who had that before you, and is that something that was taken from a place directly to be sourced for any business, or is that something that was taken from someone else's stores? So you want to be very aware of that. And I like this quote from Coco Chanel, which says that imitation is the best form of flattery. And I just want to say that that is true. However, it's also very expensive sometimes, right? And so we all probably have heard about the litigation that Christian Louboutin was involved in, having to do with the red bottoms of the shoes. Now, what's very important to know here, and this is another example of the extent to which IP laws apply, the litigation involved the red soles. And we've seen plenty of shoes that are not Christian Louboutin shoes that have red soles that have popped up conveniently after his brand kind of hit the market and made a big splash. Ultimately, what the court decided was that the color red at the bottom is not something that is original enough to be protected by intellectual property laws. And so you would think that, wow, when I see a red sole on a shoe, I immediately think of Christian Louboutin. Well, that's because he made a big splash in the market. There was nothing that was exactly like that previously. And so what happened in that litigation is, like I said, ultimately it didn't go in his favor. But the important thing to know there is that you don't want to be the defendant on that side of the litigation either, because even if ultimately the court rules in your favor, sometimes with budding fashion designers, you might run out of money before you get to that point. You might run out of money before there is a decision in your favor. And so it's best to know what the legal implications are before taking on something that might be similar to a major brand. So we saw that Costco duked it out with Tiffany and was able to hang in there all the way through and ultimately get a judgment in their favor. But they're both huge brands that have huge coffers and have general counsel and all of the accoutrements of big industry business. So, but for those of you who are starting out, it's very important to know who else is in this space with you, what is being done, what is being created that's similar to what you're doing, what you intend to create, to make sure that you're at least aware and that you take risks that you're aware of and that you're not unknowingly accepting risks that you're not aware of. Competition laws. I like to touch on this a little bit because as a designer, it's important to know what you can and can't do vis-a-vis other people who are doing the same thing, other businesses who are doing the same thing. Another thing about California and generally laws across various major states with major cities and metropolises, they are determining that competition is something that is favored, right? That you cannot limit entirely someone's ability to compete against someone else in the industry. And so, for example, in California, you cannot compete, you cannot limit someone's ability to compete with the exception of very few small exceptions. So it's important to know this for the flip side, which is if someone tells you, hey, you can't do that because we have an agreement that says that you are not going to compete. Get legal advice on that because it might be the case that that provision is invalid, that that provision is void. And so you want to be aware of what those laws are in your state and how you can choose jurisdictions that might have friendly competition laws versus ones that don't. So that's another very important area because at the end of the day, what you want to do, which I'll talk about at the end, is protect your bottom line. Another area that's very big is consumer data privacy. So there have been major developments both in the federal laws as well as the state laws about data privacy on an individual level. So for example, if you are taking payments online, if you are gaining individuals' credit card numbers, if you're gaining information about them that is private, that is sensitive, that is confidential, there are certain rules that apply in terms of how you must keep that data, where you must secure it, whether it's under electronic lock and key, whether it's under physical lock and key. It's very important also if you have a website to have the language at the bottom of your website that specifically explains what you're going to do with information that you collect. So that is an area that's very nuanced, and you want to make sure that you get legal guidance on that point before putting up a website and collecting payments. Now, if you've already done that, I would recommend figuring out what the laws are in your state. Sometimes these laws apply to much, much bigger corporations that have, larger revenue streams than you might just starting out. But again, it's important to begin the way you wish to continue. And I know that we all hope that fashion brands that you are creating are going to extend and continue and become as big as you want them to be. So might as well start that on the right foot first. Same thing with truthful advertising. And the simplest way to explain this is, when you're going to buy something in the grocery store, you buy something in the store, you want to know if organic really is organic, right? If you have something on your website, it needs to be consistent with what's on the label. It needs to be consistent with what the markers are saying in the stores, and it needs to be consistent with what all of your marketing materials. So if you are it's not okay to say, okay, well, on this particular item that I'm selling online, I'm going to say, I'm going to highlight this particular point that I'm not entirely sure about, but in stores, I'm going to make sure that that's not included because at the end of the day, it needs to be consistent across the board, and it also needs to be truthful at all of those points. We talked already about employment policies and why those are helpful and necessary, but worker safety is another thing that I want to address as well. Because what people don't realize often is that even if you don't have a factory that you personally are employing people to work in, it's important to review the contracts that you have with, for example, the manufacturing company, with whoever the vendor is that you're going to be working with, to understand that they have an obligation to abide by the laws with respect to their employees. Because what you don't want to have happen is end up in a situation that is a joint employer situation, where because you did not enter into an agreement that made sure that they were going to abide by the laws, and then these individuals were treated unfairly or injured or anything along those lines, you don't want to be brought in and have now an issue with workers' compensation and whether you have a policy or unemployment insurance or federal and taxing obligations. So it's very important to understand that if you're doing business with a vendor, with a contractor, you need to start with a contract that addresses, among other things like indemnity. Who is going to be responsible should there be a lawsuit. Ideally, you would like to be able to say that if there is a lawsuit with the person or the entity that is doing your manufacturing, based on the employees that they have, that if you are sued, that other company will indemnify you for any damages that you incur, including attorney's fees and any sorts of legal judgment or monetary damages. So it's very important to have someone review those contracts for you. Again, another plug to not pull from a website these pre-drafted policies, because you run the risk of not including all the protections that you could possibly have. So now moving into the fall season, similarly, these are some tips that I like to remind people of, especially when you're starting out. So we talked about pulling things from the website, but the other thing is boilerplate contracts. So when you are engaging with a vendor, with a supplier, with a manufacturer, with whatever it is that you're going to be, who you're going to be engaging with, be very mindful of the contract that they give you to sign. Right? So there is some language that is standard in various contracts. There will be language about what the scope of services are. There'll be language about what the payment will be. There'll be language about how the payment will be received. There'll be language about who's going to pay attorney's fees should there be a breach of the contract. There will be language about what law governs, for example. But so some of those things are routine. However, you want to be cautious about just accepting a contract that you're given and someone saying, well, that's boilerplate, that is to be expected. Always have it reviewed by an attorney. I will tell you that I've reviewed several of these types of contracts, and while they are conveyed to the potential signatory as boilerplate, often there are really self-serving provisions that are included in there, or addenda that are referenced but not ultimately included, or information about, when payments will be due and whether there will be a balloon payment, those sorts of things. It's important to have an understanding of exactly what you're signing. Don't take anyone's word for it that it's boilerplate and it's routine. And I know these things are things that we all know, that we are mindful of anyway, but it's important to hear these things again. So I always say trust but verify, but really take out the trust and just verify. It's kind of how I like to say it. Also, the foundation, nuts and bolts, beginning how you'd like to continue. So we've already talked about some of these things, like your policies, like having the right insurance coverage in place, like doing research on where you want to do business, making sure that all of your marketing campaigns are consistent, but also think about who you have on your team. And think about what sorts of information you're sharing with these people. Do you have a non-disclosure agreement in place, right? So if you have a particular way that you are preparing something or designing something, or you are marketing something, or what your sales strategy is, or what your forecasts are, you want to make sure that that information doesn't just walk out of the door with somebody who worked with you and was on your same page until they were not. Right? You want to have a legal obligation. You want to legally bind that person or those people to have in place, by way of a document, language that they cannot use your information to unfairly compete against you. So while competition in most jurisdictions is prohibited, or at the least limited to a certain geographical and scope and time frame, what is always illegal is unfair competition, and that's where we have to draw the line. So if somebody is actually taking your intellectual property, your proprietary information, your confidential or sensitive information, you want to make sure that they have a legal obligation to not use that information then against you to compete. So what are the requirements? How do you keep something that you believe is a trade secret? Well, there are a couple of ways. And the important thing about this is why I'm highlighting it, is because if you don't maintain the information in the proper way, then a court is likely to find that you were not treating it like a trade secret. And if you're not treating it like a trade secret, then the expectation is that others will not either, or that it's not a trade secret. So one of the things to remember is to have it written down. What is it that you are contending are your trade secrets? Have those things itemized. Only give access to people who need to access that information, which means if you have information stored on a computer system that you share with other people, make sure that that document or those documents, whatever it is, are not accessible just by way of logging into the computer system. So someone can log in, but you want to make sure that those documents are under electronic lock and key beyond that, so that you can then verify that only the people who have need to access this information can access it. Also, you want to make sure that you don't share this with people who might accidentally, post it to a website, right? I'm so excited to announce, that we have had record profits, and we credit that to, here's your marketing strategy. So you want to be very, very mindful of who you give information to and how you secure it, so that at the end of the day, if you need to contend that someone walked off with your trade secret information, you can prove that it actually was a trade secret by being treated as a trade secret, among other things. Outsourcing oversight too much too quickly. And what I mean by this is not only with respect to workers, but I've seen this come up in a number of different ways. So for example, it's really convenient when you work with a payroll company to kind of buy the package, right? So the payroll company is going to put everyone on payroll. Hopefully they're putting everyone on payroll. They're putting people on payroll, but then in addition, they'll say, hey, well, you know what? We can also perform your HR functions. We can also perform, your policy drafting. We can even hire and fire for you, right? We can make classification decisions for you. Is this person that you're hiring an independent contractor or an employee? Are they exempt or non-exempt? These are things you don't want to delegate to, for example, a payroll company, as tempting as it might be. And the reason I say that is because ultimately you, as the owner of the business, or the person who would be considering the hiring entity, is responsible for whatever that entity does as your agent. And I'll just give you a quick example. A very small client at the time, had a policy in their handbook promising FMLA, right? Under the Family Medical Leave Act. Well, that is not applicable to companies that have less than 50 employees, but they had outsourced this to their payroll company, and that payroll company promised it in the handbook. So, and they also made HR decisions. So they allowed someone to go out on FMLA leave. The person came back. Ultimately, not long after, was fired. Completely legal, legitimate reason. However, that person came back and said, no, I was fired because I took advantage of a legally protected right to go out on this leave that's protected, and you fired me in retaliation for that. Well, now that entity was in a situation that it had to defend, right? So you want to make sure that you have a handle on everything that is being delegated before you outsource it, and don't do that too quickly either. There are certain things, areas where you will want to delegate, right? So you will want to delegate to, for example, a lawyer to help you make certain classifications, or to a CPA to help you fill out the proper paperwork and those sorts of things. But other things, just like you wouldn't delegate necessarily your creative license, you don't want to delegate things that are relevant to your business. Importance of valuation. And what I mean by that is determining how much value your business has. How much value does your brand have? How much value does your company have? These are important things to know, because if you are ever interested in obtaining or entertaining offers for acquisition, or for merger, or for joining up with a larger brand, for example, you want to have a good idea and keep tabs on the value, the independently determined value of your brand. You don't want to walk into a very time-sensitive opportunity and rely on someone else's valuation, or not be able to find someone you're comfortable with, or get the information to that person quickly enough to be able to perform a valuation. So you can have that done. There are a number of companies that provide valuation services, but certainly want to have that as something that you can fall back on. And the last two items we talked about briefly, I got a little ahead of myself. So just to emphasize, you want to make sure you know where you should conduct certain types of business, and also be aware before you start accepting money from people, not just credit cards, but also checks and any form of payment, that you are fully aware that you are abiding by the applicable laws of protecting that information. Because essentially what those people are giving you is bank account information, their name, their address, and other details that the law is going to, in some cases, require you to protect in a certain way, and in some cases have documented. So you want to make sure that you are fully aware of that. Now entering into the winter season, I really want to talk about some of the things that you can do to set yourselves up for success. Now, I have the pleasure of being on the board of this amazing foundation, and obviously our focus is on up and coming designers, up and coming fashionpreneurs of color, specifically African American designers, for example. And so one of the things I like to stress is the opportunities that exist during the pandemic. And I say this because when there are so many opportunities for almost anyone to be a fashion designer and almost anyone to have the opportunity to market their brands. And why do I say that? During the shutdowns that have happened over the last year, people have been running their businesses more and more and more exclusively online. And so that, coupled with social media acumen, has allowed some budding entrepreneurs, fashionpreneurs, who would have otherwise never gotten noticed or not gotten noticed quickly, to gain quickly the attention of many consumers and even investors and backers and that sort of thing. And so it's very important to be aware of the power of social media. Obviously, like I talked about, there are legal implications about what you should publish and what the cautionary languages that you should include. But there are so many opportunities that are involved. So I would say don't let the legal implications scare you from this. It's not what I intend to do. I just want you to be aware. But be open to taking advantage of these opportunities, because when things start to normalize again, there's going to be less and less interest on just what's happening online. People are going to be really excited to get back into the brick and mortar stores. They're going to be really excited to go back to their go-tos. So right now, while you have the ability to try to distinguish yourself and catapult yourself, do that and find a way to rise above the noise and that's a lot of times by social media and knowing how to use that. Another thing that I talk about in connection with my diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging training is the power of you at this moment. So if you are a African American person who's in the fashion industry, or you're creating products or designs that are intended for African American consumers, be aware that I like to say that this is the time that has been set aside for investors to really take interest in supporting Black products, supporting Black businesses, supporting Black brands. So I like to say that Black is the new Black, right, during this season. So you want to make sure that you harness that to the best of your ability. And that is the same that's true for women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses. Get certified as a minority-owned business if you are one. Get certified as a woman-owned business if you are one. Also, invest in the things that are important. So those are compliance safeguards. That's not where you want to be short-sighted when it comes to where you spend your money. So be mindful of the things that are important, making sure you stay in the lanes for compliance, making sure you have someone to keep you on track in terms of the latest developments in the law, right? And also there are, depending on your size, depending on what your goals are with what you're producing, there are some opportunities to get legal services for free or for very little. So it's very important. There are a lot of small business opportunities available. So look into that. And then finally, stay laser focused on the bottom line, right? So when we think about the bottom line, we just think about, okay, well, here's how much I want to make in my profit. Here's what I want to do for the first year, for the second year, for this quarter, that quarter. And all those things are great. But beyond that, think about what you need to do to protect your bottom line, right? So this is why it's important to have proper policies in place. This is why it's important to know what the laws are of your jurisdiction. This is why you want to make sure that you are doing business correctly in your jurisdiction. This is why you want to be familiar with what's going on in the legal industry in your area, because at the end of the day, any one of those things can threaten your bottom line. So the important point there is it's not just you and your effort and your creativity that are going to lead to the bottom line that you want to have, right? The remuneration that you want to have, the surplus that you want to have, the profit that you want to have. But there are things that you don't know that you may do innocently that can impact that bottom line. So be aware of those things as well. So we have a couple more minutes left, and I want to give an opportunity for questions if you have any. I know I was kind of rushing through that, given we had to start a little bit later, but if any of you has any questions on anything I've touched upon, or even things I haven't touched upon, I'm happy to spend those last few minutes to answer those questions. Anyone?
Question. Well, starting our own business, do you have any like recommendations on how to like do that, even if it were online first? I heard like to start like an LLC and look up statewide regulations.
Mm-hmm. So the first thing that I would say is online is great to get information, but like I said, don't pull the documents offline. Or if you do speak with a corporate formations attorney to be able to tell you exactly what, by understanding what type of business you're doing, understanding what you intend for that business to do over the next several years or the next few years, that lawyer can tell you, well, this is the best type of business for you. Because sometimes people by default choose to operate as an LLC. Well, an LLC is very different from a corporation. So an LLC has a membership while a corporation has, a board and has oversight. And so some types of corporate existence require more taxes than others. So it really depends on what it is that you are doing with your company and what state you are going to be practicing business in or doing business in. But as a good first step, I would identify the jurisdiction that you want to be in. Then I would figure out what it is. Are you going to be selling a product? Are you going to be designing a product? Are you going to be, doing the creative influence? Are you going to be assisting? What is it that you're going to be doing? And given that, is it important for you to have others who are on a part of your organization with you? If it's only you, that's okay. You can serve in multiple roles, for example, in your corporation. You don't have to have other people serving alongside you. So I would say a good first step is identifying those things. And then the second step I would say is to contact a corporate formations attorney so that they can get that in place. They will set up your all of your documents initially to be filed with the Secretary of State. That is a great place to get information of your specific state. Your state Secretary of State, they'll file the information there. They'll fill out the yearly requirements. They'll conduct the yearly meetings that need to happen. Even if that meeting is over the phone with you as the president of the corporation, they'll do that. They'll keep the minutes and they'll make sure that you're up to date. So that's the first place that you would want to start. Does that answer your question? I hope so. I'm not sure if you're on mute, but if you have a follow-up question, I'm happy to answer that as well. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm happy to chat with you, any of you further, if you have questions. My email address is on the bottom of the screen, or looks like it's kind of showing under there. My email address is megarland@duanemorris.com, and you can get that information elsewhere on the website. So thanks for joining us, and I hope that you enjoy the remainder of this great event. Thank you.